In the name of the one and only God, we are starting this program on consciousness. I am going to share with you my thoughts, not from an expert point of view, because I'm not, but whatever little I know, I will share with you of consciousness, of course, in its modern sense of the word. We deal primarily in the world with two kinds of dualities. And I'll try to explain what they mean and how do we get out of the duality mode of thought that we have most often been thinking about. So one is the physical and the metaphysical. That has always been perceived as two separate realms of reality. And that has been there from ancient times, at least from the time of Aristotle in the Greek thought. So in modern times, we have moved away from that. So that's one duality. Another duality is in the context of the logos and the mythos, which is in the context of whether you reason reality or you perceive it through other senses. So we will have to go through a little bit of background that early human beings must have been wondering about the metaphysical, so to say, because their own environment was very simple. They lived in the jungles or in very plain environments by rivers or wherever they were. There was not much else that would preoccupy their mind. So they were really often thinking about the environment or the nature outside of the realm of this earthly environment that we have, the stars, suns, moons, and all that. And many of our astrological and astronomical wanderings are probably signs of that early thought of humanity. One can only assume that thinking must have been spiritual in nature, and not necessarily religious, or at least not initially. But it may have evolved in the form of a religion, because religion is basically kind of giving a ruling or a regal or falling back onto a concept with others. So communities would have created religion, individuals would have created or lived through or experienced spirituality, which for one, it was an unfortunate thing that there was a switch from spirituality to religiosity. For another, it was inevitable because whatever things people wondered above, they had to share it with one another. But what happened eventually is that this group thinking, this community thinking, that resulted in the formation of a religious thought also brought with it a sense of authority. And authority, if we look at it literally or etymologically rather, comes from the word author. Author is the one who writes. So the one who writes is the one who wrote the laws and the rules and regulations and made everyone else subordinate to it. So that's what authority is. We even, in the Arabic term, is in a way similar to that. When we talk about salahiyya, it comes from sulha, and sulha is order. And again, there were authorities whose interest was more to have an order rather than, say, an open forum. So these authorities gradually attributed things to themselves, and then they attributed them to the metaphysical. and therefore the authority of humankind, or more accurately, the authority of man, became the authority of God, and vice versa. And so, as in some of our traditions, they say, a king is the shadow of God, for example, contradictory in itself, as God does not have a shadow. But they created such terms to kind of represent the divine authority in a political context. This rigidified society even more and turned religion more into a political tool in the hand of authorities. And so the spirituality element sort of disappeared, it fell by the wayside. So most of our laws were created that way. And the next duality that I'm going to talk about would be that of what I call the geography determined. Geography will be different in the following way, that individuals and smaller communities had their own religion, but larger cities and townships and larger communities that live largely in valleys and by riversides during the hydraulic societies, so then the religion became a religion of a community. So in almost every major hydraulic society, whether it is the Greeks or the Mesopotamians, the Ganges or Ganga River, Indus Valley, and all of these, they had in a way evolved and developed their own religions. And in this sense, because people were bound by geography, their religions became very rigidified, as I said, but they also became traditions. So they felt attached to them. It didn't matter whether something was true or not, but if everyone believed in it, they followed it. So in these societies, they all formed one religion, whether it was a tribal religion or a city-state religion or a community religion or even larger regional religions. They all had sort of one God, one deity. There was something different in the Greek Isles, that the Greeks, especially when they were pushed out to the islands, there were no rivers, there were no valleys. And so when those people wanted to explore the metaphysical and find if there is a creator in the metaphysical realm, they evolved very kind of in a scattered way, if I can use that word, so that the Greeks did not evolve in a one single religion, one single God, as say the Mesopotamians would have, or the Zoroastrians would, or the others. And the end result was that that the Greek society in general became more of a polytheistic. There were many gods. The other thing that was unique about the Greek gods was that these gods were half God, half human, at least some of them. They interacted with humans, they fell in love with humans, they cursed humans, they did all sorts of things with humans. So these gods were not beyond the reach of humanity. This resulted in the formation of two kinds of thought in the Greek society. Those two are called, we could include a third one too, but for the purpose of our discussion, it's mythos and logos. Mythos, that we call myth today, unfortunately, that's a mistranslation of the word. Mythos is understanding the reality, physical and metaphysical, in the context of a story, in the context of a narrative. There are stories of how God this or that, or how we were created. All of these stories, these were called myths. And myths were binding the physical with the metaphysical. They didn't take them literally, but they understood them in a sense that they revealed a certain truth that could only be explained through the mythos. In addition to mythos, they also had the logos, and logos comes from the language, the thought, the rationalism, the way you can express something. We have the same word in Arabic, for instance, when we talk about mantiq, which is logic, logos. It comes from nutq, natiq, from saying. So it's the word that says it. We have the same reference in the Quran when God says, God taught Adam the names of things. If you take it literally, yes, it's names, but someone would say it's the name of the tree and the bird and whatever. But no, when God taught Adam the names, here the name means the logos. It means the rational. It means the reasoning. And that's why Adam decides, for instance, that if he eats, whether he eats of the fruit or not, which is a whole other story. But that was all done because God had taught him the sense of rationalism, the sense of reasoning and logic. In other words, Adam did not remain a robot. Now, in the Greek thought, then this mythos and logos, while they were complementing one another on certain issues, for example, the early Greeks would say, okay, how did the whole world came into existence? And some would say, well, there was a God who created the earth and this and that and the other. And others would say, no, there was no God, and the whole earth or all existence came into being on its own. Now, because their religious mind was not a tribal religious mind, therefore they could deal with both ideas, let's say in a more civil manner. In other words, they could hear both arguments, and they wouldn't kill each other because they believed otherwise, like we do today. So in modern times, we continue the same dialogue after more than 2,000 years. And the minute someone says, well, God doesn't exist, the earth or the cosmic reality came into existence of its own, then we are up in arms. But anyways, that is the way the Greeks did it. However, in the course of time, the mythos and the logos became more competitive. And this competitiveness created another duality. And the duality was that while in the earlier stages, the divine was experienced variously, and as I said, that resulted in the creation of polytheism. They wanted to now deal with one or the other instead of both. So sometimes it was the mythos that was dominant, sometimes it was the logos. And since European culture is primarily, at least in this regard, a Greek culture, a Greek thought, and since in our times the dominant culture in the world is the Western culture, i.e. the Greek culture, then that dichotomy and that competition between the mythos and the logos continue to this day. Let me give you some examples of the earlier period when for instance, 500 BCE, the mythos were dominant. Then around 300, that will be the time of Socrates or a little bit after, then the logos became dominant, then the mythos were pushed aside. This is what I'm talking about. The Greek thought of either one or the other, but not both. In most other societies, in most other cultures, you could deal with both. So other cultures had this and that, both this and that, whereas in the Greek thought, this evolved as to either this or that, but not both. So we move from the mythos of 500 BCE to the logos of 300 BCE. Then comes Christianity, and when the Greeks become Christians, then the mythos jumps back. So now again, people go to Jesus and all the stories that were made about Jesus, true or not, but they became part of the rites and rituals and the narratives that became a Hellenic Christianity. And by Hellenic, we mean Greek Christianity, which is the dominant Christianity we know today. And this, the mythos aspect of Christianity became so dominant that reason was thrown out of the window, so to say, and the Europeans did not want to accept anything rational. That's why, because they thought that that would oppose the Christian narrative. The Christian church became dominant. Scientists were crucified, burned to the stake, and people could not reason because they would be excommunicated. So for several centuries, the dominance of the Christian Europe kept Christianity, or Europe, or they are synonymous in this context, it kept them in the darkness. And that was at the height of this Christianity mythos. They wanted to get rid of anything that was written that was talking about the logos, about logic, reasoning, rationalism. That's why most of the heritage that we have today, from the time of the logos, of the pre-Christian logos of Greece, that is because these books and material were taken to the Muslim lands, and the Muslims kept them, protected them, and revived them. So the Muslim world started, the Muslim civilization rather, started from early on with the logos. And that's why the height of the Islamic civilization was very inclusive of all religions and all traditions, whether it was through rhyme or reason, whatever means it was. So that continued until the time of the age of discovery, where again the question was whether the earth was flat or round, or whether you could discover India or sail to India through the west or the east. All these issues resulted in the mythos slowly losing out. The fall of one Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, then the fall of the other Roman Empire. They may not have been in that order. And the result was the establishment of the new order after the Conference of Westphalia, which then established reason, brought reason back in the age of what we know as the age of enlightenment. So now again, the logos came, now the mythos went out. So this continued until at least the middle part of the last century, where the idea was that matter mattered, and nobody minded the mind, that reason was all that mattered, that God slowly, it went to a point of claiming the non-existence of God, and that it is matter that has evolved, and we have all come from matter, and there was nothing before. So we are moving now to a point where scientists, they made a lot of discoveries, and they still do. Those discoveries tell us that yes, there is matter, but it gets to a point where the matter itself can neither initiate itself nor can it give us all the information that we know. There has to be something other than matter itself. And so we moved on to discussing the issue more in terms of what you would say in terms of the primacy. And here there are there's the issue of the energy and the matter in addition to what's the right word, a consciousness, where we are headed. So people finally, scientists, I'm talking about the scientific community, they finally accepted that there is something that we call consciousness. But what is it? So in understanding it, there were questions and there were problems because the scientific community was so over rationalistic. Not that there's anything wrong with reasoning, but that reasoning itself and by itself cannot answer all our concerns and questions. So, for instance, the neuroscientists got to a point where they could detect a lot of things that happens in the neuron endings and all the signals that are given. So that, for instance, if a person reacted to a certain thing and they put that person under observation to check how the neuron endings in the person's head, how they react, they could see the reaction of those of the neuron endings. However, they could not attach anything more to it. And so, for example, if a person was under observation, was shown the picture of a close relative, the neuron endings that there, I think they believe the numbers change, somewhere around 86 billion neuron endings in the human brain, that there will be a reaction. But what the reaction meant, they could not figure out. So if the person saw a picture of a relative that they love versus a relative that they hated, the neuron endings will show the same thing. But it could not show hate. It could not show love. If a person loved the color green and hated the color pink, for example, you would show them both colors and the neuron endings will react. But it could not tell why the pink is bad or the green is good. In other words, there had to be something more than simply the biological reaction, that the neuron endings in and of themselves were not everything, so to say. And because of that, they moved towards something else. And moving towards that other thing is what we are discussing, and that is called, they are calling it consciousness. Now, if we look at the word conscience, I think we go back to the Latin base, where you have the word science in Latin, French. In English, we pronounce it as science. So science, yeah, science or science is the power to sense something. We can use the word idrak in Farsi for that, in Arabic for that. So idrak is the dark, the sensing of something. And Quran uses this word in specific situations when God is addressing humanity. Before it poses a certain question, it goes back and says, but do you know? Do you have the do you have the power of sensing it? Idrak, wa ma adraka. For example, this term is repeatedly used. it's driving or inviting us to think deeply, to sense. So understanding that way, that is seance, that is science in English. That is idrak. Now, when you put science with a prefix of co, which in Latin means together or with something, co-science, when you write it together, it becomes conscience. And conscious means that there is that which you know through your senses, the idrak, plus something else, which is the awareness. And the awareness would be, again, we can use the term agahi for it, for those of you who are thinking in Farsi. So the science and the conscience, co-science, conscience, creates a level of understanding that depends both on the inner and on the outer senses. In other words, through idrak, we understand the outer world from inside. But through agahi, we get an overall picture. We get a much more inclusive understanding of something. And that a part of the conscience or conscience creates consciousness, creates awareness, creates an awakening. It gives us an understanding of how to not just feel something, not just to sense something, but it involves a kind of a presence in there. So the perception of the sound and the sight and all that by itself is not enough. There is something more to it. And that something more is the issue of when we move to what is called as panpsychism. And in panpsychism, the idea is that every entity in the universe has a sense of awareness, that consciousness is an awareness, a perceptual awareness, and it's also an infinite entity. In other words, there's no end and there's no beginning to it. And so in that way, we become part of a total awareness, and the awareness is more like an energy that runs through us. And so from a grain of sand that is probably too big for the analytical mind, from subatomic entities that have a life, not just moving life in them, not just a sensing life in them, but a life of awareness within them. And it is that totality, that cosmic aware totality, that we can call consciousness. Now, to give you a more specific definition, and this I take from Spira, a great authority on consciousness, and he defines this that he defines consciousness as that in which all the experience appears, with which all experience is known, that out of which all experience is made. Let me repeat this again, so you can understand the totality of how it permeates every part of the existence in an awareness. Consciousness is that in which all the experience appears, with which all experience is known, that out of which all experience is made. So what is the experience he's talking about? The experience is that the beingness in the context of an awareness, that when you know, and when you know and you feel and you understand and you can sense your place in the totality of a cosmic reality. So it's in this sense then that consciousness gives birth to the universe. What this means is that consciousness has primacy over matter. We did not come from matter. Matter itself came from consciousness. So consciousness has primacy. And this, of course, will be in the context of matter and energy and consciousness. As we know, the universe, for the most part, and they estimate it to be something like 95% of all universes, either dark matter or dark energy. And I think they call it dark matter because they don't know what else to call it. But they say that it does not seem to be like matter. It's more like a wave, like a photon, like an energy in that sense. Also, the predominant theory for quite some time has been that the whole universe came into existence as a big bang at one moment. And now they are saying that probably not so, that there are big bangs that are happening all the time, that it is a continuously happening event. And in this sense, then, when we say there was a big bang, often the assumption is made that before that nothing existed. So the whole universe came into existence out of its own volition because it wanted it, and it by itself initiated. In other words, the whole attempt is made to deny the existence of any cause of causes that we otherwise know as God. Now, because since the age of enlightenment, the trend and tradition has primarily been, again, in the academia, that if you are a scientist, a research scientist, or a professor, or anyone in the academia, you just cannot talk about religion. You certainly cannot talk about God. Those issues are out, because if you speak about God as a scientist, your authority will be questioned. Very few, at the height of their career, who were safe, people like Einstein, for example, they use the word God. They accepted it in a certain way because they were safe. But the average person in the academia cannot do that. It's a taboo. You can't use the word God. That's a no-no. Now, then we have on the other side religious communities whose position I see more in this context, like let me give you an analogy. If you take a number of jars, light ones, and put some water and a fish in those jars, and put those jars in the ocean. In each jar, each fish thinks that it's in the water, and then there are fish outside in the ocean. All the fish think they are in the water. The difference is that the fish or the fishes that are in each jar, they think that only the water they are in is water. Outside of it doesn't matter. So the fishes in each jar are our modern religious communities: Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, whoever. So while we are in the ocean, but we are also enclosed by a jar, and our worldview is from our own jar. We haven't joined the ocean, and the ocean is the universal. That's the consciousness. Now, one way to understand that would be to jump out of the jar, but of course that is taboo. Just like in the academic community, a scientist cannot talk about God. In the religious community, a person cannot deny God. because that's blasphemy. So this has resulted in this huge divide where they both talk about a certain reality, but because of the labels they use, it creates a problem for a lot of people. And so this, we can also add to this the thing that the word God, for example, the definition of God that we use is thousands of years old, and it's probably in many ways very obsolete because it came into existence in our tribal societies many thousands of years ago, if not many, at least 2 or 3. And so even though today we understand God much better, but so long as we use the same word, it kind of give a signal to whomever we are arguing, is that we are talking about that traditional God. Sometimes you look at the Bible, you look at the Quran, and the God is very vengeful, very angry, and he wants to do this and that and the other. God is given a personality more even outside of the scriptures. In our cultural and traditions, the gods are very, very angry, and they are very personal and in that way. So therefore, for how we understand God in the 21st century, our understanding far exceeds the concept that is in the scripture. And I'm not saying the scriptures are wrong. What I'm saying is that the scriptures came to an audience with a much limited understanding, global understanding. And so they had to be spoken to in a context that they could understand. And that's fine. And now the problem for us today is that if we understand or interpret our scriptures in a literal sense, as I've been always saying it, when you interpret it literally, you get in trouble, because the voice, the word of God that was spoken in a different context, in a different geographic setting, to a different audience with a limited understanding. And that may not be convincing for us if we take it literally. So we will have to take it out of the literalism and understand it metaphorically, understand it symbolically, understand it more in the text of what the message is, rather than what the narrative and what the story was. So this is the major divide. And what I believe is happening now is that the religious communities that are stuck with their taboos and the scientific community that's stuck with their taboos, they are slowly moving towards one another, except that they are still using words such as consciousness that I refer to. So if you look at the definition of consciousness, it is the definition of God. For instance, when a Muslim, for instance, say La ilaha illallah, if we use that to modern scientific language, it would translate as there is no God but consciousness, and the blending of reason and revelation is the messenger. Now, you could also say that the La ilaha illallah, if it is translated in a modern times with a modern understanding of what God is, then we will translate La ilaha illallah to the following: that no object ever exists in its own right. The seeming existence belongs to consciousness. So again, the taboo words are there. A religious person is not going to substitute the word God for consciousness, or vice versa. But the idea is that they are talking about the same thing. I'm sure you remember the story that Maulana is talking about, the 4 workers who got their money, and they each wanted to buy grape, but each one was arguing that they wanted to buy grape in in their own language, whether it was fil or istafil or angur or enab. The idea is that they were all talking about the same thing, but they were fighting with one another. And I think we are just in that kind of a juncture in human history where I think that it's a time for a paradigmatic shift, where the primacy of matter is gone, partly because of panpsychism, partly because of the paramount supremacy of consciousness, partly because of the primacy of consciousness itself. And so therefore, matter has become, in that sense, it has become irrelevant that in terms of its primacy. And the same way with our definitions of God, that if they came for a different audience in a different setting under different circumstances, it worked fine. This does not affect God in its true sense. So when we say, for instance, that God is greater, greater than what? So the God that was greater for, let's say, a Meccan 1400 years was that it was greater than Mecca and maybe the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen and Sham and Syria, Damascus, but that was their world. Maybe they could go a little bit further, but there's nothing more than that, because God was greater than that limited geographic space. Now when we listen to the scientists who talk, for instance, about the nearest galaxy to Earth, to our solar system, the next galaxy has somewhere around 27 billion suns in that galactic spiral. Now, let me repeat that number, 27 billion suns. And then each sun would have how many more planets around it. Now, with this understanding, when we say God is greater, then we are talking about greater than this galaxy, and then the next one, and the next one after that. So therefore, the word God is greater has a totally different meaning because of how much we understand now in 14 centuries of scientific discoveries. I shouldn't say the word scientific in the limited sense, but in the general sense of it. And so that general understanding to me is what consciousness is. We have to understand that the existence of the totality of cosmic totality, that there is a parapsychic existence where which then matches exactly when we use the term that God Almighty is placeless and timeless, la makan, la zaman, when we use those terms for God. And so the new scientific paradigm talks about exactly the same thing, that every entity in the entire cosmic universe has a consciousness attached to it. And the scientists cannot explain consciousness because, again, like when we go to that side of the realm, there's another taboo. And they don't want to use that word, and the religious community don't want to use this word. And so we are still fighting over the istafil and the enab and the angur and ozon, I think is the Turkish word for it. So we are stuck in words, and we have in a way taken distance from idea, and that's where I think the most important word that the Islamic civilization has presented to both the logos and the mythos is the alam-e ma'na, where the archetypes find their meaning, and that is paramount to everything. And we should not be stuck more with the material stuff and all the rest of it. So I hope I confused you enough with the concept of consciousness, at least from my limited understanding. And I'm going to stop here.
Please send us the article as well. maybe I can read it again, and by reading I can understand more. It would be really great. If not, doesn't matter. I'm going to hear your lecture another time, because you record the lecture and I have the chance to hear it again. But if you have an article, or you're writing something, would be very helpful. I wanted to, repeat it and go through the science, the things, and also method and logos. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's not an art. There is no article. I just spoke from a brief outline. So if and when it becomes an article, I don't think I have the authority in some of these areas. But if it becomes an article, I will certainly share it.
Dr. Kalani?
Yes, thank you very much for a nice speech about the consciousness and what is explained about here. But I was thinking that I was always argue about the people that are against the religious ideas. If we refer to even Encyclopedia Britannica and sees these different universities here in the United States, University of Penn, University of Yale, and Brown, and many other universities, the beginner or the establisher of those universities were clergymen. And all the teaching was in the realm of religious teaching. Basically, that's what they were planning to produce or teach clergymen. And then gradually they diverted from the original beginning point. And I was thinking that, in fact, they are renegade. I'm saying those scientists nowadays. I was thinking that possibly Dr. Zaman would explain that they might go back again from that being materialistic and then become that consciousness aspect and go back again to the original thinking, or in the realm of, you may say, religious ideas. That's, if Dr. Zaman might explain a little bit, possibly has some version.
Yeah, if the Western mindset is dominant in the context of the either or and both, then they do have this problem that it would have to be either one or the other. Other societies have evolved differently. For instance, Islamic civilization, both the religious aspect of it, as well as the non-religious or the rational, the sciences, they all worked side by side. In the Hindu society, the same thing. But the Western society has this problem, and that's what I refer to as one of the dualities. But let's hope that it gets to a point where they could entertain both concepts. And so since the latest scientific discoveries, or at least theories rather, have shown that matter has no primacy, not anymore. So then they have to accept something other than matter that would have been responsible for all the creation. So what started? So that's why they are saying that, that their consciousness preceded matter. That matter comes, consciousness give birth to matter, if I can put it in very simpler terms. And so that argument is accepted now by the higher ups in scientific communities. In most universities, when you listen to them today, they cannot deny consciousness. They have trouble defining it. They have trouble explaining it. And part of that problem might be that they don't want to say the word God, because then that they lose all the credibility in it. But then they haven't found another word for it. And that problem is for the religious community also. I mean, when we say God or Allah, the same thing for most of us, it connotes a 1400-old concept. That doesn't mean that God doesn't exist or exists. That's not the issue. The issue is that a certain word carries with it a certain baggage. It carries with a certain meaning, and divorcing expressions from meanings is not an easy thing. So if we talk about the essence of a divine being that is supreme and the creator of all entities, we can accept in this definition. We can accept this definition. However, the moment we give a name to it, then the sensitivities arise. I'm sure that those of you who read Yusuf Ali's Quran, for example, the Rabitatul Alam al-Islami in Saudi Arabia, they ordered that all of them had to be rewritten and do the retypesetting. So anywhere they have the word God, it has to be changed to the word Allah, for example, for whatever reason. So that I'm not going to go there, whether the reasons were valid or not. But again, the sensitivities arise in that sense. Now, for instance, in Pakistan, where certain words are commonly accepted. For instance, you can say goodbye and you say Khuda Hafiz. Now, the new sensitivity in Pakistan is that you're not supposed to use Khuda because Khuda is not the same as Allah. So then they say Allah Hafiz, which is a newly coined term. So if we show this degree of sensitivity to the expression of certain words, imagine if one is to suggest the same in a religious context or in a scientific community. So that's why that level of tribalism between the religious community and the scientific community is there. And the unfortunate part of it is that the religious community is lagging way behind. Most of our research, most of our scholars in the religious realm are still stuck. A whole lot of them are still working on the hadith that may or may not be valid, or they are talking about jurisprudence or the verdicts that were given by certain fuqaha 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago. They base things on those, so they are not waking up. So it's unfortunate that we have turned religion into a tradition. We have turned the tradition into a history. We have turned a history into the history of societies that who lived under circumstances where nothing of that is relevant to our life today. And so they are not, the religious community is not taking the challenge. Let's put it this way. They are not taking this challenge, but it's a great opportunity for them to jump in here. And also, it would be ideal for the scientific community also to break that barrier so that we can learn in the context of what we call ilm. In the Arabic word, ilm is to make the unknown known to you by whichever means possible. And therefore, in the ilm, the awareness and the sensing of things are together. In modern science, the idrak part is the correct translation from my point of view for modern science is the science of idrak, not the science of awareness. They are now moving from the idrak only to the sense of awareness, and that awareness is consciousness. And so both camps are still far apart, but at least they are heading in that direction. And I hope that humanity will benefit from their cooperation.
What about this, when there was materialism after initial religious or those ideas that theologists were spreading around, but they came by materialism.
Yeah, for the great majority, materialism is still valid. Most of us who are not up to date on modern reading, they're still thinking materialistically. But the higher ups in the scientific echelons, they have already buried materialism. For them, it's gone. They are moving from materialism to consciousness, and that's why this whole talk was there. But this would be at the higher level of the scientific community, not at the average. Most of the people, especially from our part of the world, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, there are still those who are not religious or anti-religious, let's put it that way. They are still playing dancing to the music of the materialist primacy, but that is gone since 1960s, 70s, especially since 1980s, with all the new concepts that were developed again by the scientific community, not by the religious community. To them, materialism is dead and gone.
Reasoning is towards consciousness, in fact.
There's nothing wrong with reason. Of course, we do accept reason. But the point is the view here is that if a bird is flying, don't make it fly with one wing, that it either has to be mythos or logos. It can be both. So when, for instance, Mavlana says, Pay istidlaliyan chubin buad, pay chubin sakht be tamkin buad, the idea is not that he's rejecting rationalism, but he is rejecting rationalism only as the only means by which. And that's where the higher ups in the scientific community today have realized that they have been trying to fly with one wing for a long time and it didn't work. I think Dr. Fatemi had a question.
Yeah, I had a question related to the meaning of the word Allah and consciousness. My understanding, the way I think about it from a 21st century perspective, is if Allah means no thing, nothing, that I think of it as no material thing. And I don't know if you agree with that, but I'm also curious to get your perspective. What did Allah mean for the Arabs of the 7th century of the Hijaz? I imagine for them it meant something more like no idol, no circumscribed worship thing. But I'm curious how the word Allah can be evolved to our times.
There are different definitions for it. Mine is the same as the one you gave, that what the Quran attests to the fact that God is unlike anything that you can imagine, anything that you can think of. So God is not a thing in that sense. But I think historically it was the word existed pre-Islamically. If we define Islamic from Prophet Muhammad's time, it existed before that. The Arabs of the south, southern Arabia, their god was Rahman, which has become Rahman. And the god of the northern Arabians, primarily, of course, they had other gods too. Of the north was primarily Allah. And so Islam is combining the two in a sense. So yeah, if you would talk about God as the nothingness, would be that which is anything other than you can imagine.
But I imagine that would have been a little bit beyond what some of the people of the 7th century could have grasped. Would you agree, or maybe not?
I would think that the higher ups, and here I'm talking about the hierarchy of those who knew, the select few. If I don't know if the word select applies here, they would have known that. They would have known. The average person wouldn't. Even today, the average person doesn't understand these things because most people are not. The best we become religionists. We are not theists in the sense that the thea is as God. And again, here is another bridge between the scientific community and the non-scientific, because in science, when they start working on a theorem, the word theory and theorem becomes with the word theo, which is God. The very word for which they create an idea, a theory, that begins with the word of God. And I don't know that most of them are probably not aware of that, or even if they are aware of it, what can they do? That's an accepted norm. I think 90% of the people, if they are religious customarily, let's put it that way. It's a tradition in society, something that geography determined for them to be a Muslim, Christian, Jew, whatever. And then of the 10% remaining, it is not anyone's preoccupation. And by preoccupation, I mean, yes, there are clergies and mullahs and imams and akhuns, who make it a profession because that's a way of for them to earn their living. But to be God-centered for no other reason than to know, for instance, the cosmic totality and how it came into existence and where is our place in it. And if we think in those essential terms, there is a God within each one of us. Just remember both arguments that the la makan har makan that we use in Farsi, as well as the panpsychism concept, they come together exactly the same way. Or when we talk about the absolute non-duality that the scientists reach now, and the wahdat al-wujud that Ibn Arabi advocated 8-9 centuries ago, they talk about the exact same thing. So at that highest level, there is a whole lot of conformity. Sensitivity is still there, but the conformity of the thought is where it brings all of that together. So today you can talk to a very, very knowledgeable Buddhist or a very, very knowledgeable Muslim, or for that matter of any other religious community, with a very, very knowledgeable scientist. For instance, take Einstein, for instance, he did not deny God. And for Einstein to say that he doesn't deny God, but then you come to this lower rank scientist, the first thing they do is they have to deny God to become credible. So yeah, it depends on the level of one's connectedness with the cosmic totality. And the way you approach it.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't think about the connection between some of the old mystics like Halaj and others who were killed for having this minority perspective. And nowadays people are, as you mentioned, canceled, or they lose their tenure if they express views that are heretical sometimes.
Yeah, but even scientifically speaking, they're saying the complexity of the human brain is in some ways greater than the greatest, the most crowded galaxies. So in that case, we have a whole other universe inside each one of us.
The inner world and the outer world. Yeah.
Exactly, and the divine is within. And so, yes, in the traditional form, that's why I started with the early tribal societies. Gods were outside elements somewhere in there, and we give them personality. But with a better understanding, the God within is much more. And so, if you even look at the Islamic tradition, where did Prophet Muhammad find God? Not in the public square, not in the city, not in the crowd. He went to a cave, denied himself the whole world. He sat in the dark. He found it in his heart. He found God within himself first. Then, even when he came out, he waited for something like 2 to 3 years until he started sharing it with the community. So to me, the first qibla towards which we should be praying is the cave in Hira. And the first qibla is Hira because that's where the first Quran was revealed. And so, but of course, the tradition says something totally different.
I'd like to see some of these references that you are talking about, that the scientific community has made a turn in 80s or so. I'm kind of familiar with some recent ones, and maybe after 2010 or something, that some scientists have And I listen sometimes to this consciousness speeches and stuff like that. I didn't know that it goes back all the way to 70s and 80s.
To mostly to 80s, yes. Just again, you have to be prepared to understand their language in their terms and what do their terminologies connote. Yeah, if you use parapsychism, you will find a lot of literature under that, or consciousness. There's a lot of that. But sometimes there are people who have more religious inclination, and they want to drag the word over to their religious belief systems. Remember, the fish in the small jars that are floating in the ocean. So there are sometimes people who are still in their jars and claim that they see the whole ocean. Yeah, they do have a view, but it's a view from a window. But they are not swimming in the ocean. And a better understanding for us would be, regardless of whatever your orientation is, I think that we jump out of those small jars and swim in the ocean of consciousness. I think that's where I think Mavlana is also talking about the Bahar Dar Koza or Koza Dar Bahar analogy. I think it befits there perfectly.